Welcome all to another episode of the Most Notorious podcast. I'm Eric Rivenes. We continue this series of interviews about the Whitechapel murders with an in-depth look at one of the main suspects in the case, Aaron Kosminski. And as a reminder, this episode contains adult themes and listener discretion is advised. It is with great pleasure that I introduce Robert House to the show. He has studied Jack the Ripper for decades, and he is one of the world's foremost experts on suspect Aaron Kosminski. His book is called Jack the Ripper and the Case for Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect. Welcome to Most Notorious. Great to have you on. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. So how did you first enter the Jack the Ripper fray?
I honestly just read a book about it. I read one book, which was by Philip Sugden. I think it's called The Complete History of Jack the Ripper. I don't remember the exact title, but it's a great book. It's one of the best books on the case. And after I read that, I just kind of got sucked into the whole mystery. And there's a big online community of people that are constantly debating facts and trying to do research and things like that. So after reading this book, I got involved on online message boards and things like that.
Right. So it was Sir Robert Anderson, right, whose mention of a suspect was the catalyst that brought Aaron Kosminski to the surface.
Yeah. Anderson was the head of the criminal investigation department at Scotland Yard at the time of the Ripper murders. He actually never named Aaron Kosminski. In his sort of biography that he published called The Lighter Side of My Official Life, which came out in 1910. So this is 22 years after the Jack the Ripper murders. In that book, he said that the identity of Jack the Ripper was actually well known to the police, but that they didn't have sufficient legal evidence to bring him to a trial. But Anderson never actually named Aaron Kosminski as being that suspect or as being Jack the Ripper. It wasn't really until many years later that people sort of put together the pieces and figured out that he was talking about this guy named Aaron Kosminski. I mean, the way that happened actually is that in the 1950s, a police document was discovered called the McNaughton Memorandum. And in that, this is an internal police document that was written a few years after the Jack the Ripper murders. And in that document, Melville McNaughton listed 3 suspects in the case, one of whom was Kosminski. Now, he didn't give a surname, he just says Kosminski. But he says, Kosminski was one of the top suspects that we had. But nobody at that time connected him with Anderson's statement. It wasn't until, I believe it was 1987, so it was pretty close to the centenary of the murders, that a book was discovered. And this was a copy of Anderson's book that was owned by Donald Swanson, who was the investigator who was in charge of the Jack the Ripper murders. And Swanson, at some point, it's not really known when, but at some point he read the book. So this would have been after 1910. And he penciled in some notes in the margins. And in the margins, he says Aaron Kosminski was the suspect. So in other words, Anderson declined to name the suspect for various reasons, but Swanson, in pencil, wrote in Kosminski was the suspect. So when that was discovered, and this is called the Swanson marginalia. At the time that was discovered, people sort of put the pieces together and said, oh, this is the same person McNaughton was referring to as Kosminski. So at that point, and this is in the 1980s, several newspaper articles came out and said, well, it looks like the Jack the Ripper case is solved after all. So that was sort of how Aaron Kosminski's name came to be known by ripperologists.
What language did Anderson use to describe his suspect? And why do you think he was coy about not using the name?
He basically said that the traditions of my department would suffer. I think in Anderson's mind, he was probably thinking about libel, but basically what he was saying was, we knew who the suspect was, but we didn't have sufficient legal evidence to convict him. And, I think that it would have been considered bad policy to name a person as being Jack the Ripper when, he was never tried, he was never brought into a court of law, that sort of thing. So, Anderson used the term moral certainty, which, the way he was thinking about it basically meant that there was sufficient proof in his mind to convince him that he knew that this person was Jack the Ripper. But Anderson, being a lawyer, knew perfectly well that they didn't have what would have been required to prove him guilty in court. But that said, he mentions that there was an identification, that Kosminski was identified by a witness, and the witness refused to testify effectively.
So Anderson's description of the man who he believed was the murderer has led to a lot of discussion over the years. He used the words Polish Jew to describe his suspect. McNaughton, I believe, used the same words. And there were other clues in these descriptions by Anderson and McNaughton as well to offer a better picture of who they believed this person really was.
Yeah. Anderson, in fact, made numerous comments in various interviews and articles leading up to 1910, sort of hinting at the fact that the police knew who Jack the Ripper was. He doesn't really quite come out and say it until the publication of this book in 1910. But yes, he says that the suspect was what he calls a low-class Polish Jew. And he says that it was a remarkable fact that people of that class would not give up one of their number to Gentile justice. He was brought to task for that statement at the time his book came out, for effectively saying it was anti-Semitic. But, the point that he really, very strongly makes is that it was not a matter of theory in his mind. It was just a proven fact that this person was Jack the Ripper. He doesn't go into a huge amount of detail about the suspect. There is more information in the McNaughton Memorandum and to a certain extent in the Swanson Marginalia. I mean, Anderson just kind of comes out and says, we knew the identity of the murderer. And he says he was identified. He doesn't really give much more information beyond that point. But then when you look at the McNaughton Memorandum, for example, in that document, McNaughton says Kosminski had a great hatred of women. He especially hated prostitutes. He had strong homicidal tendencies, and he was removed to a lunatic asylum in March 1889. He also, at least in one of the versions of the McNaughton Memorandum, and there's two, he said that he resembled the individual who was seen by a city PC near Mitre Square. So that was murder number 4. It's generally believed now that he was sort of mistaken in saying that because there's no actual evidence that a city PC witnessed a suspect at that murder, but there was a witness at that murder. He just wasn't a city PC. So there are a few mistakes in these documents, and that has caused quite a bit of controversy. The Swanson Marginalia is another example. In that, Donald Swanson, who, as I said, he was the head of the Ripper investigation effectively at Scotland Yard, he says that after Kosminski was identified and the witness refused to testify to this in court. So, he basically says a witness identified him, but then refused to testify. After that time, he was released back to his brother's house in Whitechapel, and then he was kept under surveillance by the city detectives. And then after that, he says he was brought to the workhouse with his hands tied behind his back, and then later he was sent to Coldney Hatch. And then Swanson says he died shortly afterwards, which has always been kind of a mystery because Aaron Kosminski did not die shortly after he was admitted to Colney Hatch. He died in 1919, so about 3 decades later. My feeling is that Swanson was either confused or for some unknown reason, he came to the conclusion that Kosminski had died in the asylum.
Some believed that Anderson was describing another Ripper suspect, John Pizer, known as Leather Apron.
Yeah, people have been interested in the Jack the Ripper case for a century and have been trying to solve it for quite a long time. And, if you go back into the 1950s, 1960s, they didn't know who Anderson was referring to. They had no idea. They thought maybe it was John Pizer, because he does say he was Jewish. And Pizer was, one of the known suspects at the time who was, arrested and questioned by the police. But it clearly was not Pizer. It was actually Martin Fido, who's a professor at Boston University, who discovered Aaron Kosminski's name in the asylum records. And that was after the Swanson marginalia was discovered in the 1980s.
But Fido, even though he's got this great piece of information that he's uncovered, he still basically dismisses Kosminski as Jack the Ripper, right?
That's right. I've always thought it was the strangest thing. When the newspapers were reporting in the 1980s after the Swanson marginalia was discovered, the newspapers were kind of saying, well, it looks like the case is actually solved. But you get a distinct sort of sense from reading those articles that it was a bit of a letdown, in a sense, because people have often thought of Jack the Ripper as this sort of almost romantic supervillain type character who is supposedly, kind of an aristocratic type figure roaming around wearing a top hat and kind of a tuxedo, carrying a black bag or something like that. When the Swanson marginalia came out, and it was clear that they were talking about this guy who was a lower class, rather ordinary guy, I think people were, a bit disappointed or something like that. Fido does give some reasons why he dismissed Aaron Kosminski as a suspect at the time. And also Donald Rumbelow gave some reasons as well. I think the general reaction at the time was not so much dismissing Kosminski as a suspect, but saying there's still additional work to be done. We need to learn more about him and things like that. But that said, Fido came up with an alternate sort of theory that I don't really want to go into right now, but claiming that Kosminski was actually mixed up with another person whose name was Nathan Kaminsky. And, to be perfectly honest, I found Martin Fido's theory to be pretty convoluted and doesn't make a huge amount of sense to me. But yeah, I would have thought that if you were the person who discovered Aaron Kosminski in the asylum record, you might have just said, hey, I solved the case, here's the guy. But Fido didn't do that. I could never make much sense of it. But to get back to my own interest in the case, like I said, I started out reading this book by Philip Sugden. And Sugden dismissed Aaron Kosminski as well, partially because, I feel like the main reason Kosminski has been dismissed as a viable suspect by a lot of people is that he does not fit what most people think of in their mind as their sort of profile of how they picture Jack the Ripper being. Kosminski, on his asylum record, it was said that he walks around the street and picks up bread out of the gutter and eats it. He was also admitted to an asylum a bit after the first asylum he was admitted to, which was Colney Hatch. The second asylum he was admitted to, and where he stayed the rest of his life, was called Leavesden Asylum for Imbeciles. And when you see that he was admitted to something called an asylum for imbeciles, you think, okay, well, that means Jack the Ripper was an imbecile, and he's going around the street picking up pieces of bread out of the gutter. And so it just, in my personal perspective, it just didn't fit the way most people pictured Jack the Ripper. And a lot of my research following up on that was trying to disprove the reasons that he had been dismissed by other people. So that involved, for example, pretty extensive research I did into the history of asylums in England. Now, I don't say this is not original research. This is just me reading various sources about the history of asylums and the history of the treatment of mental illness in England. And I came to find out, first of all, that the term imbecile was an actual, strictly defined medical term. It was not used in the sort of derogatory sense that you would call somebody an imbecile nowadays. It was an actual term for a particular class of insanity. And Leavesden Asylum was, as I say in my book, nominally an asylum for imbeciles. But in reality, it was an asylum for people who had mental disease that was determined to be incurable. So a person like Aaron Kosminski, who had schizophrenia, would have been the type of patient that would have been admitted to Leavesden Asylum for imbeciles because his schizophrenia was clearly not curable. He was transferred from Colney Hatch, which was a county asylum, and some of the people at that time kind of thought that the people in a place like Colney Hatch would be mental patients who they thought had some hope of being treated and kind of cured. Kosminski being incurable, but also presumably not being considered to be dangerous at that time, was transferred to Leavesden Asylum for imbeciles. So, I kind of went through the various aspects of what was known about Aaron Kosminski, and the more that I learned about him, the more I thought he actually fits with probably the type of person Jack the Ripper really was. And that I think was really, probably the most valuable sort of writing and thinking that I did on the case.
One of the things he was accused of being, right, was a self-abuser.
Yeah, numerous times he's described as practicing self-abuse and what they call the solitary vices. These are both euphemisms for masturbation. And that was, in fact, self-abuse was actually marked down on his admission to Colney Hatch Asylum as being the reason for insanity. So, at that time, masturbation was thought to have actually caused insanity. It was also thought to have caused a number of other disorders, but insanity being one of them. And, not much is known about this, about what this actually means in the case of Aaron Kosminski. I did actually get to read at one point some really interesting sort of, kind of a memoir that was written by one of the attendants at, I can't remember if it was Colney Hatch or Leavesden. I think it was Colney Hatch Asylum. And he wrote about that. He wrote about how some of the patients in the asylum masturbated out in public, just out in the open. At the time, I thought, was he actually referring to maybe Aaron Kosminski? Because this was one of the attendants who actually had made some of the notes on Kosminski's case file when he was at the asylum. But nothing's really known about this, but at the time, I believe some of the other Ripper researchers, that was another reason to dismiss him as a suspect. But when I later started researching like the FBI's study of serial killers, the work that was done by the behavioral sciences unit at the FBI, compulsive masturbation was one of the most common traits of serial killers. And there are numerous serial killers where this is noted, that they were arrested for masturbating publicly. Jeffrey Dahmer was, for example. This other guy named Haddon Clark, same thing. So it's a really common trait among serial killers. So yeah, just another one of those characteristics that I thought the more I looked into it, he fit better as a suspect in that.
Interesting. So you did some of the really groundbreaking research on Kosminski, right? Among other things, you helped find his birth certificate.
Yes. For a number of years, I did a lot of work with another researcher named Chris Phillips, who lives in London. And Chris is a guy who I just met, in these online forums and things like that. And so we used to email a lot back and forth, just kind of collaborating on this stuff and suggesting ideas to each other. Chris did a ton of amazing research. And we worked on this kind of stuff together. And I believe that he originally suggested how to find Aaron Kosminski's birth certificate in Poland because nobody had ever done it before. And I think, oddly enough, the reason nobody ever did it was because it was really because of two things. One is that it costs some money to pay the Polish archives to do this sort of research. I mean, I don't speak Polish, for example. So I submitted a research request to the Polish State Archives. But you need to know which part of Poland you're looking for, because the state archives are located in these gubernias, which are kind of like states effectively. There's no central sort of database. So you need to submit it to a particular gubernia in Poland. And we had found, or Chris, I think, had found one naturalization record of a person that at the time we didn't even know was related to Aaron Kosminski, but we suspected he may have been. And on that naturalization record, it gave his hometown, I think it was Kalisz. And so we said, well, maybe Aaron Kosminski was from somewhere near here. So we submitted the research request to that area, which was the Poznan State Archives. And that's how we found his birth certificate and all the other vital records of his family, which is his siblings, his parents' marriage record, things like that. And then basically what happened was that after we had discovered that stuff and we got more information, especially about his siblings, we were able to do additional research of records in London, and then learned more about his family and things like that.
So what do we know about Kosminski's life before he immigrates with his family to England?
There is very little known about Kosminski's life in general, especially about his life in Poland. There's only a few, scattered documents. It's known that his father died, I believe, when he was 9 years old. And, his brother, his oldest brother, who was named Isaac, emigrated to England in, I want to say, 1872. So this is, 15 years before the Jack the Ripper murders. And then a couple of years later, his father died. And so the family must have been really struggling to survive at that point. I mean, I don't really know how they were getting by exactly, but, there's one document that lists I can't remember how it says, the primary caretakers or something of the family as being Aaron and his brother Wolf, who at that time were, they were in their early teens. They were probably working at that time, I would assume. Their father was a tailor, so they were probably working as tailors in Poland. But, very little is known about them at that time. What I kind of did to kind of fill in the gaps is just to try to paint a picture in my book of the general historic, what was going on generally at that time, especially for Jews living in what was then part of the Russian Empire. And basically, there was widespread anti-Semitism. And after the assassination of the Tsar, Alexander II, in 1881, there was a massive wave of emigration of Jews fleeing Russia and going west, going mostly to England and America. And so Kosminski's family was part of this massive wave of Jewish emigration from Russia. And it was a pretty brutal period in Jewish history. There was anti-Semitism in Russia, and the way I write about it in my book is it was kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, because once there was this massive influx of Jewish immigrants in the East End of London, that then caused further backlash and further anti-Semitism in the 1880s. So the way that I present it in my book is that there was this sort of increasing anti-Semitic sentiment, especially in the poorer parts of London at the time, that really sort of peaked right at the time of the Jack the Ripper murders. And, that's really, I think, very important in understanding Kosminski as a suspect for various reasons. I mean, I think the most important reason being that a large part of the FBI's analysis of serial killers in general is in terms of causation, in terms of what causes a person to become a serial killer. They will talk about the fact that they grow up in environments characterized by these really hateful, violent environments where they see authority figures as being ineffective and things like that. So, I can see that Kosminski might have been a person who had a lot of just anger. I mean, clearly Jack the Ripper did. So, in any case, I think that that's important to understand what he probably was like as a person. Now, like I said, what is known about Aaron Kosminski in general is pretty limited. All we really know comes from his Asylum records and what's written about him in these police documents that I refer to. And that's it's really pretty limited amount of information. But one thing that is clear is that the police would have known much more about him at the time. So they must have had some kind of file on him as a suspect that has just disappeared over the years.
Right, right. Is there anything in his background that suggests he hated women, that he abused women?
There's nothing that's known. No. At one point I speculated on some of this stuff, and I feel like I kind of jumped the gun a little bit there. No, there's nothing really that's known specifically about his background in that regard, but it's certainly possible. And like I said, if you believe or put credence in the MacNaughton Memorandum, he just says explicitly that he had a great hatred of women, especially of the prostitute class. But no, there's nothing actually known there.
So as the Autumn of Terror unfolded, was there a particular moment, do you think, when police were introduced to Kosminski and perhaps became suspicious of him based on a possible exchange?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and it's something that a lot of people have speculated about over the years. The short answer is nobody knows. Nobody knows how and when he came to the attention of the police. There are a few very plausible possibilities. One is that he may have come to the attention of the police in 1890. This would be July 1890, when he was admitted to the workhouse for the first time. He was brought to the workhouse apparently because he was probably, exhibiting some kind of insanity, some kind of symptoms of insanity. And the police were on the lookout for this type of person to be showing up in, asylums and workhouses who were insane. They were looking at them for suspects. One thing that's very important to remember is that the options that the police had in terms of solving crimes were so much more primitive than modern techniques. They had nothing like the modern forensic crime scene analysis. There was no DNA, obviously. They didn't even have fingerprinting at that time. So there was really practically nothing at the crime scene that they could use to solve the case. So what they were really hoping for was either to catch someone in the act, to have some witness come forward, or to maybe just find someone wandering around in the streets who is insane that they could then question. Their options for solving cases were pretty limited. They did do house-to-house inquiries. So one of the possibilities of how he came to the attention of the police is through house-to-house inquiry. And in fact, that's sort of what is suggested by what Anderson wrote. Anderson sort of implies that he came to the attention of the police while Anderson, was out of the country, and as a result of house-to-house inquiries. He doesn't exactly say that, but he kind of implies it. And it's a very good possibility, and it's one that I wrote about in my book. The most likely time, I would say, is October 1888. So basically the crimes took place from August to November 1888. And October is the only month when there was no murders. But in October, there was this very curious incident, which is usually referred to as the Batty Street Lodger incident. And this is something I write about in my book. I don't want to go too much into detail here, but basically what happened was the newspapers reported in the beginning of October, this is just after the double event, the murders of Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes. The newspapers reported about this incident where a lodger in a rooming house in the East End gave some laundry to his landlady to wash. And then he sort of left the country. He went away somewhere. And when the landlady opened the laundry to wash it, she found it was covered with blood. This story was reported in several newspapers in the beginning of October, and it's also been repeated in a lot of Jack the Ripper books. But what's not so much talked about in a lot of the Jack the Ripper books is that story about the Batty Street lodger was clearly misreported. And this became very clear when I started looking at a whole bunch of newspaper reports that were follow-ups to the original article that basically said, something along the lines of like the original story was kind of misreported. There was actually no lodger at all. It was just a person in the neighborhood who brought the laundry and dropped it off at this woman's house to wash it. She was a laundress. The fact is that the story actually did happen. I mean, it's quite clear that something happened there, and there was some suspect that the police were very interested in. And the story effectively, the real story was that a person from the neighborhood dropped off some clothes, and there were blood stains on the sleeves and the front of the shirt, of one particular shirt. And the laundress, apparently, they don't really say this too clearly, but I get the impression, apparently what happened is she mentioned this to probably a neighbor. The woman didn't speak very good English. She spoke German mostly. But she mentioned something to a neighbor about bloody laundry, and somehow the police learned of this when they were doing these house-to-house inquiries immediately following the double event. They then, kind of waited in the house until the person came back to pick up his laundry, and at that point they brought the person in for questioning. In fact, they brought two people in for questioning because the person who dropped off the laundry said the blood didn't come from him. He said it came from a friend, quote unquote, a friend who cut himself accidentally with a knife. But the thing that I found that was so interesting was that one newspaper article, it gave a bit more information about the person who was arrested. It said that he lived within a radius of a few hundred yards of the Berners Street murder. And it said he was a ladies' tailor. And both of Aaron Kosminski's brothers were ladies' tailors. And both of them lived within a radius of a few hundred yards of the Berners Street murder. So I think it's very plausible that this whole Batty Street lodger incident could have been talking about Aaron Kosminski. And that's how he came to the attention of the police. Again, it's not known for certain, but I think that's a very likely possibility. And one of the other things that I found that was very interesting is that so Aaron Kosminski, his address is not actually known for certain. He almost certainly lived with one of his siblings. On the Asylum record, it does give his address, and it's the address of his brother Wolf on one of the records, and it's his sister Matilda on another one of the records. So he was, he probably lived at different times with different siblings. He may have, lived various places. But I have thought that he probably lived most of the time with his brother Wolf. And Wolf Abrams lived just to the south of Berners Street, where the Elizabeth Stride murder took place. And it's very interesting to me that on the very day that the Batty Street lodger incident was first reported in the police, the very next day, Wolf took his daughter out of the school that she was in. And she was in this school that was directly across the street from Dutfield's yard, the site of the murder of Elizabeth Stride. And the reason that's very interesting to me is because I've always felt that it's most likely that Aaron Kosminski's siblings suspected him. I'm not saying that they knew that he was Jack the Ripper, but I think that they may have suspected him of something. And if this Batty Street bloody laundry incident was actually how the police learned of Aaron Kosminski as a suspect, I can see that they may have taken their daughter out of the school because they may not have wanted her talking about things that were going on in the house, like discussions that were going on around, what to do. So, this is in the realm of speculation, but Anderson himself said that his people probably knew of his guilt but refused to give him up to the police. So, that's in the realm of speculation. So, getting back to your question, I would think he came to the attention of the police either through the Batty Street incident in October 1888 or when he was first admitted to the asylum in July 1890.
It was his brother who actually had him committed.
Yeah, it was his brother who had him committed. I mean, it's really hard talking about the Jack the Ripper case, especially when you're talking about a suspect like Aaron Kosminski, because, like I've said, so little is known about him. So little is known about what actually happened with him as a suspect in the case. So, I have to keep saying we don't really know. We can only sort of speculate. But the impression that I get from reading what Anderson wrote, what Swanson wrote about, Kosminski, the impression that I get is they probably had a very strong suspicion that Kosminski was Jack the Ripper. They couldn't legally bring him to court for the crimes, but if that was the case, probably what happened was they probably figured out some way to have him put away. So it could very well be the case that the police were at least aware that he was committed, and they may have been involved in having him committed to the asylum. One day when I was looking through the Colney Hatch asylum records, which are held at the London Metropolitan Archives, it's a really interesting document. You can just flip through and you're looking at the original admission records and things like that. I found this loose sheet of paper. It was actually signed by Robert Anderson. And it was, I'm forgetting the name of the department, but it was some department within the Metropolitan Police for monitoring asylum inmates. And Anderson wrote something about, please, it was something along the lines of, please inform please inform our department if this suspect is ever released, something like that. So it's clear that the police were sort of monitoring people in the asylums who they thought were dangerous. And, I have speculated that if the police were involved in having Kosminski admitted to an asylum and in monitoring him and making sure that he never got out of the asylum, that it would have been a very closely held secret. They could not afford to allow that information to become public. It's something that people have pushed back on quite a bit, saying, well, if the police really knew Jack the Ripper, why wouldn't they just say who it was? There are numerous reasons you cannot say who it was. I mean, for one thing, you can't just go around accusing somebody in the newspaper or in some public forum. You can't accuse somebody, especially of a crime that notorious. Anderson never would have done that. And the other reason is because, as I said before, because of the really, the really heightened anti-Semitism at the time. There were almost riots that broke out against the Jews in the East End after the murder of Annie Chapman, because, the locals thought this must have been done by a foreigner. They said an English person could never have committed such horrible crimes, things like that. And, there was really the very real danger of riots breaking out against the Jews in the East End at the time. This is also why Commissioner Warren made the decision to wipe the Goulston Street graffiti off the wall on the morning of the double event, even though it was one of the only pieces of, it was one of the only actual clues in the case. He erased it. They washed it off because they were afraid that riots would break out against the Jews if the Goulston Street graffiti was discovered. So the police were very aware of this. So they would have very much wanted to keep this a secret if they were involved in Aaron Kosminski's admission to the asylum. They would not have wanted the press or anybody to get wind of the fact that A, we believe we know who Jack the Ripper is, and B, he's Jewish. That would have been extremely dangerous for Jews living in the East End. It would have been extremely dangerous for Aaron Kosminski's family. So, I really believe that, it's possible that there was some, I hate to say it, but it's possible that there was some kind of cover-up that happened here. If if we're to believe Anderson. You think about it like this. If we are to believe Anderson, the police were clearly aware that Kosminski was admitted to the asylum. They must have kept tabs on him. That's what it seems like to me. And if you read through between the lines in some of these documents, it seems entirely possible that that's what happened. There was some kind of intentional intent by the police to keep that a secret. In fact, this is sort of hinted at in the Swanson marginalia itself, where one of the notes that Swanson makes in the marginalia is when Anderson writes, I can't remember if he was remarking on the identity of the writer of the Dear Boss letter or the identity of the Ripper himself, but Swanson writes, known to head officers of CID only. Meaning that even the identification of Kosminski by a witness may have been only known to certain people. Himself, Anderson, maybe a few others.
Yeah, interesting. So there is a gap, right, between the murder of Mary Kelly and when Kosminski enters the asylum in 1890. There's more death, of course. The Thames Torso murders, for instance, in 1889.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you make of that? I don't know much at all about schizophrenia. But if that had a lot to do with his compulsion to kill, is it possible for someone in his mental state to simply put the murdering on hold?
The simplest explanation is to say that, first of all, you have the murder of Alice Mackenzie in 1889, which very well could have been one of the Jack the Ripper murders. The police and the medical inspectors at the time were sort of divided on whether they thought it was a Jack the Ripper murder. And today, that is not considered one of the canonical murders, but in a lot of respects, it looks very similar to the canonical victims. So there's that to keep in mind, that he may not have stopped really after Mary Kelly anyways. There's also the murder of Francis Coles, which took place in 1891. Now that's the one where I say in my book that if Francis Coles was a victim of Jack the Ripper, then Aaron Kosminski could not have been Jack the Ripper, because she was murdered after he had been admitted to Colney Hatch Asylum. But the easiest way to explain sort of a pause there is that he knew he was under surveillance by the police, probably at that time. Swanson, for example, says that after he was identified, he was returned to his brother's house and then watched by the police day and night. The police had him under surveillance. And he makes it clear that he also knew that he had been identified. Aaron Kosminski was well aware that the police had this witness who identified him. Identifications were very different at that time, apparently. It's not like it is nowadays, where you see in the movie that, a witness is behind a sort of a two-way mirror and they bring in 10 suspects and they point out that's the person. The way they did it back then was they just walked up to the person and said, "Is this the guy?" He would walk right up to him, and say, "Is this the person here?" And he would say, "Yes." That was called a confrontation identification. They did do other types, but, the suspect was clearly aware that he had been identified. So, it's entirely possible that he stopped murdering because he was being watched. And that's said by a few different people. There was a detective who, at the time of his retirement, he wrote about his time keeping one of the suspects under surveillance. And it's very likely, in my opinion, that person was also talking about Aaron Kosminski, although he doesn't give his name. But he says that he was admitted to an asylum later. The police strongly suspected that he was the killer, but they couldn't prove it. They had no definitive proof. And that person sort of says that after we put this person under surveillance, there were no further murders. So this kind of gets back to my speculation around the Batty Street bloody laundry incident, which was in October. Because It's kind of a very open question about when this identification actually took place. Nobody knows when the witness identification of Aaron Kosminski happened. Some people have speculated that it may have happened in July 1890. Others, like Paul Begg, for example, speculated that it happened much closer to the time when Aaron Kosminski was admitted to Colney Hatch, as this would have been February 1891. But it's entirely possible that he was identified much earlier. He may have been identified in October 1888. According to this other police detective I referred to, whose name was Henry Cox, he said the way he put it was, it wasn't until the last murder that we got on the scent of this suspect, something like that. And so that would have been November. So the identification could have taken place as early as October or November 1888. And if that was the case, and if he was then kept under surveillance at that time, you could see that that may have led to him not committing any murders. Even if he was under surveillance as early as, like, say, the beginning of October 1888, you could say, well, maybe this is why he didn't commit any murders for that month. And, then it raises this question about, well, how long are the police really going to be keeping him under surveillance? I mean, they had many suspects. Kosminski at that time was not the only suspect. Like, even if he came to the attention of the police in October 1888, he would not have been the only suspect the police were looking at that time. They had probably, dozens of suspects they were interested in. So, it's entirely likely that they would not have wanted to spend the money and the police resources to keep him under surveillance for weeks and weeks or months. They may have kept him under surveillance for several weeks. We don't really know how long he was under surveillance for and at what time. One thing I speculated in my book was he may have been under surveillance at different times. He may have been under surveillance in October 1888. He may have then been under surveillance later. We really just don't know the answers to these questions. But it's kind of one of these situations where you say, well, where there's a lot of smoke, there's probably a fire. There's so much kind of circumstantial evidence, apparently, that suggests that Kosminski was the strongest suspect that they had. And, like I said, we can really mainly only go by what Anderson, McNaughton, Swanson wrote about Kosminski, but they clearly had more information about him than we know now. So the case may have been even stronger than what we know now. We also know that he threatened to attack his sister with a knife. That's in his admission to the workhouse asylum. When he was brought to the workhouse in 1891, he was examined by a police surgeon who was actually a police surgeon for he was one of the metropolitan police surgeons for H division. And the witness said, the witness, who was a man named Jacob Cohen, the document says he threatened his sister with a knife. It's not clear if where it says his sister, if that's referring to Jacob Cohen's sister, or if it's referring to Aaron Kosminski's sister. It's generally been assumed that it's referring to Aaron Kosminski's sister, who is named Matilda, and she lived on Greenfield Street. But some of the research that was done after my book came out discovered who Jacob Cohen was. He was actually Aaron Kosminski's cousin. He was born with the name Kosminski, so his name at birth was Jacob Kosminski. And his sister was Betsy Kosminski, who married Wolf Kosminski. So Jacob Cohen was actually the brother-in-law of Wolf Kosminski. So when he says he threatened his sister with a knife, now Jacob Cohen doesn't say that, but it's written in the document. It says, the witness says he threatened his sister. I think it's probably Jacob Cohen's sister, which would be Betsy. I mean, that itself is suggestive. I mean, there's no other suspect really that I can think of who's documented it threatening a female with a knife. So that itself is interesting. There's also some other interesting documents that suggest that a female was possibly an informant in the murders. I won't go into too much detail here, but there's a document called the Crawford Letter, which was a letter of introduction. that a woman would have carried with her, but it was a letter of introduction written by the Earl of Crawford, and it was brought apparently to Robert Anderson because it was discovered in his archives, which are located in I think they're in Virginia. And this is the only document in his archives, his surviving archives, that even refers to the Jack the Ripper murders at all, I believe. And it says, "This woman, whose name I do not know," the person who wrote this letter of introduction didn't know the name of the woman, apparently because she refused to tell him. He says she suspects someone who's nearly related to her. So it was a letter of introduction to Robert Anderson. Now, that kind of fits in with my general thinking on what probably happened, which is that probably Kosminski's family suspected him. And it's entirely possible that one of his family informed the police about their suspicions, and that may have been what got the whole ball rolling as well.
Yeah. So we have this nameless witness whom Anderson mentions, and there are multiple possibilities, right? Israel Schwartz and others.
Yeah. Joseph Lowand is the main one, although some people have said Lavender is a more correct pronunciation of his name. It was probably either Schwartz or Joseph Lowand. And, it's one of these things that's been very much debated by ripperologists. So I have tended to feel like Joseph Lowand is probably the witness, but it's not really known.
So the witness saw someone with Kate Eddowes, and the description he gave, does it match the height, the build of Kosminski? Do we even know what those are?
That's a good question. I can't say that the height of Kosminski is even noted in his file. I don't really recall, but there's not really much of a description of Kosminski anywhere. So it's a bit hard to answer that question. Yeah, I can't really say. It gets to this interesting point, which is that I really spent a lot of time trying to think about if there was some way of finding a photograph of Aaron Kosminski, because there is none. It's possible that one exists somewhere. Myself and Chris Phillips were in touch with Aaron Kosminski's ancestors because we kind of tracked his family tree. This is not Kosminski's ancestors because he had no children, but the ancestors of his siblings. And there was a photograph of his sister that we found, but there's no photograph of Aaron Kosminski that's known. But one thing that was interesting is that there probably was a photograph of him taken when he was admitted to Leavesden Asylum, because the asylums started to take photographs of the inmates on admission. But they started to do that right around the time when Aaron Kosminski was admitted, about in 1892, 1893, where they started to take these photographs just as a matter of process when patients were admitted to the asylum. And it was true at Colney Hatch as well. But when you look through the Colney Hatch registers, which are at the LMA, there are books of photographs. And, there's a page for February 1891, and there's no photograph of Kosminski there. And, I got the impression that they sort of just took photographs of some of the people and didn't take them of everybody. But I suspect that there was probably a photograph in his Leavesden Asylum record. The problem is that for the first, decade or so, when he was at Leavesden Asylum, his record from that time has just completely disappeared. Now, I'm not saying that is suspicious. I do think I know why it disappeared. I believe it disappeared because the asylum records, which were kept in a particular, asylum up until I'm going to remember, I think it was the 1980s, at which point there was kind of a flooded basement, and there was a pipe that broke, and all these old records got completely, soaked with water, and they just threw a bunch of them out. They just tossed them. And I believe that Kosminski's Leavesden Asylum record got thrown out at that time. So there would have been a photograph of him probably. We don't really have much to compare, with any witness identifications. Although there were a couple of witnesses that said that a suspect that they saw looked like a foreigner, which, foreigner basically meant Jewish at that time.
I want to ask you more about geographic profiling and how you use it to make the case for Kosminski. You've got maps in your book. You are able to identify likely where he was living in relation to the murders. And the piece of apron that was found the night of Catherine Eddowes' murder, you theorize that he dropped it as he was walking in the direction of his home.
That's right. If you've been to this part of London, which is the East End, and walked around, as I've done many times, and all these people who study the case, ripperologists, they walk around and visit all these, sites of the crimes and things like that. You sort of get a sense of how you walk around there, and the streets that are the most populated by people, especially at nighttime, where there's a lot of bars, there's a lot going on. They're kind of the same as how they were back then. Commercial Street, where the 10 Bells pub is, and then the next street over, which is Brick Lane. They're very happening, very lively places. And at the time, it was the same way. There was a lot of bars, there was a lot of nighttime activity, people walking around. And the Kosminski families lived to the south of Whitechapel Road and Commercial Road. They lived in a more residential part. So it was really the part north of Whitechapel Road, Whitechapel High Street, where, there was all this bustling activity around the bars and pubs and things like that. And this is really where more like the prostitutes were hanging around as well. So walking around there, if you walk down Whitechapel High Street and Whitechapel Road, you can get to Aaron Kosminski's residence that way from Mitre Square, where Catherine Eddowes was murdered. But I sort of think that if you've just committed a murder, you wouldn't probably go that way, because that's really the main street. There's going to be all kinds of police there. There's going to be more people walking around. There's another street that's parallel to Whitechapel Road, which is called Wentworth Street. It's a bit more of I don't want to say desolate street. It's still a fairly main thoroughfare, but it's a bit less populated. And so I speculated that this would have been a more likely way that you would travel if you were trying to get to the vicinity of Greenfield Street, which is where Kosminski's brother lived, from Mitre Square. And going that way from Mitre Square pretty much directly passes by Goulston Street, which is where the bloody apron was found. And that bloody apron was one of the few clues that they had in the case, along with the Goulston Street graffito, which was found at the same place. And all that you really learn from that piece of evidence is the direction that the killer walked after the murder, which is east. So, yeah, I think that very much fits with, geographic profiling, that if you're looking at Aaron Kosminski as a suspect. But, just in general, the place where he probably was living at the time was very central to all the murders. You can walk from where he was probably living to any of the murder sites within a matter of a few minutes, 5-10 minutes. I mean, it's another interesting thing that wasn't actually discovered until after my book came out, which is the address of where Wolf Kosminski, his brother, was living at the time. And where I suspect probably Aaron Kosminski was mostly living, and that was a street called Providence Street. His address was 25 Providence Street, and that street is directly south of Burner Street, where Elizabeth Stride was murdered. I actually stood once at the corner of what used to be Providence Street. It doesn't exist anymore, but I stood at the corner of where that was, and it's directly around the corner from Dutfield's yard. I mean, you can practically stand there and see the location of that murder at Dutfield's yard. You can practically see it and see Kosminski's house at the same time. And it was a matter of 1 or 2 minute walk, effectively. So, he lived, very close to all the crime scenes, really. And I mean, one other part of the geographic profiling that I think is interesting is that a lot of serial killers have said that they would go out hunting every night, nightly. They were out there hunting all the time. And for Jack the Ripper, his victims were prostitutes, and the prostitutes were, mostly hanging around in locations more like to the north of Whitechapel High Street. And that's where the majority of the murders took place. The only one that really took place to the south of that street was Elizabeth Stride. But that one, if you went to London today and walked around Brick Lane or walked around Commercial Street and then tried to walk back to Providence Street, you would go directly down Burner Street. You'd walk right by Dutfield's yard. And a lot of people have speculated that that was a crime of opportunity. It takes place earlier than all the other murders. And it was also, arguably the murder where he was closest to being caught because there were other people around. Most of the other murders took place very late at night, 3 a.m, 4 a.m, even 5:30 in the morning. I mean, the murder of Annie Chapman was basically as the sun was coming up, that murder was committed. But the Elizabeth Stride murder was the earliest one. It was about 12:45. But there were other people around. There were other people hanging around on the corner, walking around. And I think, to me, it's quite clear that he almost was caught at that time because, Israel Schwartz saw him and potentially other people as well.
Right. So how do modern profiles done on Jack the Ripper line up with Kosminski, your suspect?
So the FBI profiling stuff I mainly got from a book that was the result of these initial interviews that the behavioral studies unit did with serial killers, in which they kind of try and come up with characteristics and find commonalities between different serial killers. And there are things like absent father figure, instability of employment, or instability of residence. Compulsive masturbation is one of them. And then ineffective social environment. So there's a lot of things like that. If you look at those types of characteristics, Kosminski fits very well. And in fact, John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood, who wrote the foreword of my book, they did a profile of Jack the Ripper in 1988 for a television program. So they actually profiled Jack the Ripper, and they said he would have been a local, he would have been unwashed sort of person. And they said that that Aaron Kosminski fit their profile effectively. I mean, another interesting thing that Roy Hazelwood said to me when I was talking to him on the phone is that he said, we believed that Jack the Ripper had schizophrenia. And I said, well, why doesn't it say that in the profile? Why didn't you write that in the profile that he had schizophrenia? And he said, because when we write a profile, the target audience for the profile is law enforcement police officers, effectively. And he said, we don't put any kind of psychological diagnostic type labels into profiles because the assumption is that the police don't know anything about that type of stuff. So he said what we did instead is we described characteristics that a schizophrenic person would have that they believed. So, I mean, that was pretty interesting to me. And, but, another thing that I did was I kind of looked at it from the opposite direction, which is that I kind of starting with Aaron Kosminski and knowing that he had schizophrenia, probably, his asylum records make it clear that he very probably had schizophrenia, although it doesn't say that explicitly, but he heard auditory hallucinations. He had an instinct that was telling him what to do, things like that. So what I did was I researched serial killers who had schizophrenia to try to see if Jack the Ripper matched the criteria, or if he matched the profile of a schizophrenic serial killer. And it seems to me likely that he did. And of course, this is the conclusion that the FBI apparently came to when they did their profile. Schizophrenic serial killers are actually somewhat rare. Most serial killers are not schizophrenic, but there are some who are. The most famous ones who people think of when they think of serial killers with schizophrenia are probably David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, and the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe. But both of those probably were kind of faking it. Berkowitz said that he was receiving instructions from his neighbor's dog. And Peter Sutcliffe claimed that he heard like auditory hallucinations that were instructing him to rid the world of prostitutes effectively. But I mean, in the case of Sutcliffe, I think he was saying it just to try to get a lighter sentence, and probably the same with Berkowitz. But there are actual serial killers who were schizophrenic. They're somewhat less well known. People like Richard Chase, Haddon Clark, Mark Sappington. They're less well known, but the characteristics of schizophrenic serial killers is that they're often what the FBI called post-mortem mutilators, which is what Jack the Ripper was. He was apparently mainly interested in, sort of eviscerating his victims and mutilating them after death. And this is a frequent characteristic of schizophrenic serial killers. People like Robert Napper. And there are numerous accounts which, when you read them, they sound very similar to the Jack the Ripper murders. There's a schizophrenic serial killer, I can't remember his name, but he cut off the woman's breasts and eviscerated her. They often target like the genitalia and the sexualized parts of the body, and engage in cannibalism as well, which Roy Hazelwood told me he believed that Jack the Ripper quite possibly did engage in cannibalism because he took some of the body parts with him. So yeah, I mean, Kosminski is, he's interesting in that regard. But I really did try to make it clear in my book that most people who have schizophrenia are not violent. But that doesn't mean that there are not people who have schizophrenia that are violent. There's been a certain amount of research done on that. They would often find that there was comorbid psychopathy. So you have these people who are, already psychopaths, and then they also have schizophrenia on top of that. So it's been interesting researching this case to me, because I'm not a professional historian. I'm not a professional person in the mental health field or anything like that. So I've just kind of tried to pick up a certain amount of information about these fields, none of which I'm an expert in. I think that the analysis of Kosminski as a suspect who had schizophrenia is definitely one of the most important aspects of assessing him as a suspect in that case. Some people have said that because he had schizophrenia, he wouldn't have been able to hide his guilt. And frankly, I don't know if that's the case or not. I really don't know. But I mean, schizophrenia is also, it's not just like this diagnosis where it's the same in everybody. It's quite clear that Kosminski, his mental state degenerated over time. I think in 1888, it may have been around the time when he had the onset of schizophrenic symptoms. But much later, he was, his mental state degenerated to the point where he was much more severe schizophrenia. I think when he was younger, he would have had more like what people refer to as paranoid schizophrenia, probably, which, actually my understanding is that that's on the milder end of the spectrum, because you'll have people who can still hide their delusional thinking from people, and in a lot of respects go about their life without people knowing that they're crazy.
So he was placed in an asylum that was meant for non-dangerous people. And there was another asylum, Broadmoor, that was used for the criminally insane. If the police believed that he was this notorious killer, why would they have been okay with him in an institution filled with non-violent patients? You did have to be convicted of a crime to get into Broadmoor, right?
Yes, you had to be committed of a crime. In fact, I mean, Anderson said that explicitly. He said something like, if we could have convicted him, he would have been put in Broadmoor. Yeah, like I said, he was originally admitted to Colney Hatch, and then 3 years later, he was transferred to Leavesden Asylum. And Leavesden was supposed to be for cases that were uncurable and also less dangerous or not violent. But there were people in Leavesden who were considered to be dangerous and violent. That's something I definitely came across in my research. And there were patients who were considered to be dangerous enough that they were kept under restraint as well. So Leavesden would have had that type of patient as well. But like I said, if we're to believe what Robert Anderson wrote and what McNaughton and Swanson wrote, then they would have been aware that Kosminski, who they believed was Jack the Ripper, was admitted to Colney Hatch and then later Leavesden Asylum. So one can only speculate, but they, in my mind, they must have informed somebody at the asylum to keep this person under restraint or something like that. Or it's hard to say whether they would have informed anyone at the asylum, like administration, that they thought this was possibly Jack the Ripper. So it's really not known.
Right. So I want to ask you about this while I have you here. In recent years, a silk shawl has surfaced that was allegedly owned by Catherine Eddowes and connected to Aaron Kosminski, right?
Right. So, yeah, there's kind of a long history to this. This was in a book that was written by Russell Edwards. Came out, I don't know, about 5 or 6 years ago. I can't remember exactly when. I mean, to make a long story short here, he purchased a shawl, Victorian shawl, and it had some oral history that connected it to Kate Eddowes' murder, like the crime scene. And then Russell Edwards contacted a scientist named Jari Louhelainen. They apparently did some DNA analysis of substances found on the shawl, and he claimed to have connected the DNA effectively to both Aaron Kosminski's descendant and one of Kate Eddowes' descendants. And then this was a big story in the news. This is what his book was about, basically. He said he solved the crime with DNA analysis. And he claimed that, it was connected to Aaron Kosminski. There are so many problems with the shawl story that it's kind of been sort of dismissed by most serious researchers in the case. Starting at the very beginning, there's no actual legitimate sort of provenance that connects the shawl to any of the murder scenes. There was an extensive inventory of all Kate Eddowes' belongings and her clothing that was written up at the time of the murders, and there's no shawl listed. The police officer in whose family the shawl descended was not known to have been at the Eddowes crime scene at all. I believe the shawl itself was dated to the early 20th century by Sotheby's at one point. So there's really nothing that connects the shawl to this crime scene or to the Jack the Ripper murders at all. That's the first problem. And that problem has never really been, resolved as far as I'm aware. What I suspect is that this shawl might have come from some other crime, that took place, in the early 20th century or maybe the late 19th century. And, over time, the story might have kind of evolved into being, that it was related to Jack the Ripper or something like that. That's what I suspect, but I don't know for sure. All the other problems are related to the DNA analysis. Now, when they first released this information to the public, people very quickly sort of came to the conclusion that a mistake had been made in the actual science. So effectively what happened was, and I'm not an expert in, DNA or anything like that, obviously, but the DNA that was taken from the shawl supposedly came from bloodstain. It's what they call mitochondrial DNA. Now, I don't really know much about this, but with mitochondrial DNA, you can't make an exact match to a person. So what they talk about is the resolution. In other words, that if they can find a rare sort of mutation in the genetic sequence. That if it's a rare mutation, they can say it matches 1 out of 500,000 people on the planet, something like that. And, in a sense, if that matched, say, one of Kate Edo's descendants, that would be a fairly significant finding. What they do when they have these mutations in the gene sequence is they enter those mutations into a database to sort of see how rare they are. And apparently the way that it was entered into the database was just entered incorrectly. They called it an error in nomenclature. And they initially said that it was an extremely rare variation that would only match, say, 1 out of several 100,000 people, or maybe even several million. I can't remember the exact figure. But it turned out once they fixed this error in nomenclature and entered it correctly, it was an extremely common sequence that matched like 95% of the human population or something like that. There was also supposedly a match to apparently what they described as being seminal fluid on the shawl, although they were never able to verify that that's actually what it was. And again, I'm kind of going off memory to a certain extent, and I'm not really an expert in any of this. I believe they called it epithelial cells. Again, I don't really know what that means exactly. But they gave very little information about this match. The way they described it was very vague and kind of unclear. So the shawl came when this information was initially released. It came under criticism from a lot of scientists, a lot of very serious genetic scientists, who pointed out the error in nomenclature and other problems. Among the problems was that it was not peer reviewed at the time. This finding was not published. It was not subject to peer review in scientific literature. Several years after they initially came out with this finding, they did publish it in a journal. But when it was published, the article still did not contain the really relevant data that would have allowed other scientists to duplicate their findings. They did not publish the actual gene sequence that they extracted. There were all kinds of problems, even in the published paper, which did go through peer review. Obviously, nobody knows who the reviewers were. But when this came out, I was on a podcast with a scientist named Tori King, who is from the University of Leicester, and she's very famous, world-renowned geneticist. She was the person who analyzed the remains of King Richard III, which were discovered in England and verified that it was in fact King Richard III. So she's a really highly regarded genetic scientist, and she looked at this published paper and basically said it should never have been published in this state. It's kind of unpublishable was the way that she put it, because like I said, they did not publish the actual genetic sequence. They didn't publish any data that would have allowed anybody to actually replicate their findings. There's also the problem that the shawl itself could have been contaminated by DNA from other people who handled the shawl over the years. So there's just really so many problems with the shawl. And the fact that they neglected to publish the data, I think looks very suspicious. It kind of gives one the impression that there's some, I don't know if I want to say fraud exactly going on here, but I think that the finding, there was either an error in the science or something like that. So in any case, that's my basic analysis of what went on there. I really think that the science was highly flawed. Let's just put it that way. And, I think it was largely just done to sell books. I mean, when you have a case this old, difficult to solve, and you kind of come out and say, solve the case with DNA, that's the type of thing that sells books. So that's basically my take on the shawl. I think that it was just, I don't think the shawl even had anything to do with the Jack the Ripper murders, and I don't think the DNA matches either Kosminski or Kate Edo's. So that's basically my take on that.
Right. So he dies at age 53.
Yeah.
And you have been to his grave, right?
Yeah, his gravesite it's in the eastern part of London. And yeah, it's still there. It's the inscription is kind of being worn off over time. But yeah, he was, the rest of his family is buried in a different cemetery, a few miles away from where he's buried. He's the only member of the family that's buried in this particular cemetery. The rest of them are all buried elsewhere. And the rest of them went by the name Abrams as well. Aaron Kosminski is the only one whose grave says Kosminski on it.
Right. So how can people connect with you? I know you have a Facebook page.
Yep, there's a Facebook page for my book. Yeah, the book, my book is still available on Amazon, and there's a lot more information in there than, obviously we went over here.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, you're welcome. It was great talking to you.
Again, I have been speaking to Robert House. His book is called Jack the Ripper and the Case for Scotland Yard's Prime Suspect. This has been another episode of the Most Notorious podcast, broadcasting to every dark and cobwebbed corner of the world. I'm Eric Rivenes, and have a safe tomorrow.